you probably get
council from
a good time over the holidays. Any of the other people?
2:30.
Well, yes and no.
Start.
It's difficult when you have business that has like frozen.
Scary?
It would have been challenging, I would imagine. Yeah.
And we had a break-in on it.
I heard about that.
They have their deals. They cut themselves.
You'll be fine.
You know, you never know
Yeah.
what,
getting in touch with people, but they have the license plate, and then they stopped somebody in Port Alberni for like running a stop sign, and they had
yeah, so you never know, right?
Yeah.
How
They don't,
digital version.
they don't put a lot of,
I missed the whole thing. I left the day before.
The power outage? I know some people came home and realized that the freezers had been frozen.
Yeah, mine was refrozen.
I don't
Only
think
was that one.
I
Yeah,
could
it's
still,
you. Look at how,
like, it was
It's
still
the
cute,
reflections
so I think
that
it
I
just
couldn't
see from
was
that, so
con-
now
I was
I
so
like
cold
this
out
better,
anyway.
kind of.
Yeah.
or maybe that's in the COVID candle.
I'm gonna call the meeting to order with the gavel. Since they never chair me. Calling the meeting to order at 6 p.m.
May I make a motion to amend the agenda to move the third item of correspondence to the top of the list so that our presenter can listen to any discussion we have on it?
Okay. We'll just, 1 becomes 2, 6, 2 becomes 3. Okay. I guess we need a motion.
I'll move
for
to
that.
amend, or,
Move the motion is carried.
Yes, nicely done.
All right. And we've had nobody sign up for public comment on the agenda, so we'll go.
Here this evening. It's nice to always come and do a little bit of an annual presentation to local councils. My name is Mark, which is a multidisciplinary network in our region looking at social determinants of health and just kind of the that affect our overall health as we move through the life stages. So that's kind of our and how we kind of work in order to plan with our local communities and who we're working with. So the Alberni Claiquot and some attention from Island Health. Our region, the Alberni Claiquot Regional District, has at that point and still to this day has some area profiles. Those are kind of measured and compared throughout Vancouver Island. So Alberni Claiquot, Waddington in the Mount Waddington area, in order to look at different ways of conducting health services and health planning. They recognized needed to be done in order to plan with these communities. So in 2012-2014, the network began stakeholder involvement, or that might look like. They received a grant from Island Health in order to do a lot of this work over those years, and we've actually continued that grant funding and that initial strategic planning and really tried to get going on everything, hired a coordinator, and in 2014 we said this is really not working, and we stopped everything and did a governance. I was very heavily involved with the hospital committee and the ACRD, and it was very top down. So during our governance refresh, we were really looking at ways that we could re-engage the community, what the community health data, what the community voice, and what our community leaders were saying, rather than a project around a walk-in clinic in Port Alberni. Because we know that that is, while important, maybe not going to affect as many. So here we are today, that should say 28, working very closely with other networks within our region, whether it be other organizations, other actual networks working at targeted kind of community engagement and planning. We've also had quite a lot of success through that engagement, networking of networks, in actually implement. What we've really focused on is ensuring that we have good, clear community voice coming up through our various mechanisms. We have a couple ways that we being just kind of face-to-face meetings and communications, presentations to the leadership tables, and a variety of other different mechanisms. Outline of what our network looks like. The network bubble that's encompassing everything is really everybody in the Alberni-Clyquot Regional District. So we work with the three and really strive to do as much outreach within that geographic area as possible. I am the only staff person though, so I rely on individuals that are at our leadership table. So 12 to 15 members from this kind of great selection of community partners at this point, and kind of leverage resources when needed in order to implement projects, but also make. We also have action tables which are more specific to some of our areas of interest. So we identify housing and homelessness has been one really great example of that, where we support the existing initiatives that are taking place when they're not necessarily being done. But in these circumstances where there is no regional partner that's bringing together the stations. So transportation as it relates to health equity in our region has been one of our longest standing actions. So this last year we adopted our brand new strategic plan. In the past we were working under 5 strategic priorities, and our strategic plan, a little bit specific in strategic plan and our priorities with the systems change work that we do. So our strategic plan is now really focusing on and kind of those health outcomes and health programs or community programs that affect health but are not in acute health services. So Island Health has their above upstream from, so looking at the different ways, the different small tweaks and larger kind of components that we can work on collaboratively. Priorities are network development, community connectedness, building regional prosperity, and knowledge and capacity building. Connected communities is primarily our transportation work, but we really increased kind of the scope of that a little bit just to other things that increase health and are related to accessing services. So we've had the West Coast Transportation Working Group, which has been a very successful. We have a transportation roundtable, which has met annually and isn't always the most productive, but we have produced a transportation assets map, which you can find on our web throughout our coast to accessing healthcare, specialized healthcare, especially in outlying communities, or from outlying communities to the city centers. Study and just kind of ensuring that local partners are well engaged in that. Specifically within the First Nations communities, and we work with community stakeholders around planning and transportation planning in both Port Alberni and Port Alberni. Building regional prosperity is our very nice term for our poverty reduction. So it's really trying to, with the various municipalities, the ACRD, and the Toquat Nation. So that was signed last year. You know, is one of the signatories on that protocol. What it really spells out is just the will of you. It's a very loose protocol, but definitely a first step in looking at this as a regional priority. And knowledge and capacity building is one of our last kind of public priority areas, and this is recognizing that there's a lot of emergent issues around health and community services that we need to be able to respond to. So a great example of this was last year, we assisted to convene a regional housing discussion, and then and planners from the regional district and the districts that we were able to bring that forward to support our UBCM. To convene the Alberni Valley Services meeting, which is meant to increase service integration and work within the Alberni service providers. It's a little bit outside of this area.
Marcy, we just at the 10-minute mark, so I just
Sure.
need a motion from the committee to go beyond 10 minutes. Okay.
I have one slide left. So, last slide. Our communications, part of our network development out of the network. So we have our new website that we launched a year and a half ago. Tools on it, resource guides, directories, our transportation assets map, and all the information. Looking for different areas where we can create some more tools and get more information from us. My contact information is there if you'd like any further information.
comments or questions from committee members? Okay, hearing none, I'll just thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcy.
Thanks, Marcy.
Managed to skip over adoption and seconded. All in favor? Carried. Okay, correspondence. So,
Thanks.
Mayor Osborne.
So, package, I think that's great. It's good for the public to be able to see that we received this. The letter from the ministers about the UBCM funding was a good reminder that we've had about the fact that it is restricted to projects that take place on local government land. And so nevertheless, and we had a short discussion with her to sort of tease out how flexible they are around that funding application for childcare projects being built on local government land and the building to be owned by local government land, but it would move into second priority, and their first priority in that category would be those local governments that had a 99-year or large, and their third category would be 25 to 49-year leases, and they aren't willing to consider need to be in place or agreement need to be in place before the application was submitted. They said no, but you would need to show evidence that you were actively engaged and it was being. So I think that really kind of puts a nail in the coffin for us in terms of being able to apply to that funding. Nevertheless, there are two other possible I had already told you about with. In talking to Island Health about their willingness to apply to ministry funding, a different pool of money with in such a way that infant and toddler care could be added to the existing district daycare. This set at the school, on school, but would open up the opportunity for the district's child care center to be reprofiled as, or renovated a little bit and turned into more of an infant toddler focus. And then you all agreed by resolution to support the regional district's application into UBCM for child care planning, and Marcy is one of this little update. And so lastly, there's an iron in the school district, find the other will go, great, why don't they do it? So I think what's most important and what I've talked to the two different players there about is we need to convene with Island Health and school district, and what could next steps be in terms of determining how can the district support if needed. And so that's my update. Unless Bob has anything to add.
Thank you for the outreach and for kind of taking this off the table a bit, because when me, and I think in a sense, although that the West Coast Resources is taking this here like the Army problem solvers, where there's actually real intangible things that are on the ground that are there, and just a sense where you hear community need and you don't necessarily get that uptake. And I have land. What we don't have is a commitment of council that this is a priority, or somehow resourced to make this a priority process, and just about everybody spoke to the need for addressing childcare. So yes, we do need the information and the statistics, although one could read the statistics. I just want to comment that, the talk is great, but, where there are opportunities and there's motivation from the facilitator support, how that can go forward. So I'll just keep trying to encourage and support whatever dialogue.
Anyone else like to comment?
Maybe just to follow through, Dorothy, with your comment in terms of, in my understanding as a new councillor, that especially for incoming new councillors, the opportunity at that time to discuss those items that we may find has come up through the. And do you see that as the place at this stage of the game to the priorities for the community?
Well, it certainly fits under our vision to action and the sense of homes and neighborhoods and such, and yeah, all of that. So that's not in our B2A, but nevertheless, it's.
Okay. I think we've covered that then. So we'll move on. Of conduct report from the working group. Further discussion? let to start?
Thanks. So I sent council an email and I copied Elise on it, and Elise and I had a very brief chat relation. And then, do we want to do this? Do we want to? And that if somebody feels uncomfortable about going forward with this or questions the purpose or reason, that would be something we're comfortable about moving forward. I think we need to understand, do we want to try to develop this internally? With the resources that we have like Elise, or do we want to municipalities, or something else that maybe I'm not thinking about? Another thing I wanted to plant a seed about was the possibility of timing this with a facilitator to help move us through a discussion. That would be a good way to use those resources, but also that we're in a way that's not a meeting, and so it's a different atmosphere and a different feel when we're collaborating that way together, so that we could kind of really move through some to maybe to finalize it a little bit in the draft that UBCM has provided. So those are my initial. Sorry, regarding how much extra, I don't know much about code of conduct. Like, we did one through Tourism Tofino, so I kind of understand the idea, and I think it's a good idea. But in deciding between I guess it's a question to staff. If you have any insight or...
Well, in the conversation that I've had with just the mayor, so not with the entire council, the draft that UBCM has provided is, and I think that there are some things that we can do, as the mayor said, to finalize this, and that does fit quite well with strategic planning, because they're asking you for a fuss at a strategic planning meeting anyhow. So I think it could be a bit of a combination where you might have, once you have these conversations at your strategic, the code of conduct can be done by staff fairly easily after those conversations have been had.
In terms of code of conduct, is there?
There's staff code of conduct.
Staff.
There is staff.
Yeah, it's my understanding that this was moved at UBCM due to in getting their business done. And I've only experienced that once on council in a serious way, for elected officials for sure. Because I have a feeling he wouldn't pay attention to a code of conduct either. So I do question the value of it to some extent, but I'd like to hear from everyone what they think.
Yeah, thanks. I understand, for example, the mayor has talked a lot about governance perspectives, and if this supports that, I'm in favor of it. I think, the more tools in the toolkit, all the better. I think it should be done in a strategic plan. I don't think it needs a whole lot of time and attention, so I'd be inclined to make a motion to that.
Difference with this code of conduct and as to the oath we swear when we get sworn in. And then the second question is, what are you going to do if somebody doesn't stick to the code?
Different than the oath of office that we take. And the oath of office is like the bare bones, the duty that we have to serve an office that's set. Well, you always have to go back to the legislation, and the legislation is very, very strict on what you can and cannot do, and there's very, very few tools of understanding what our expectations are of each other and what the public's expectations are of us, and vice versa. So to go through the act of it together, and I would suggest, it's being an orientation discussion around what it means. And I think it's a good opportunity to have the discussion about the values that we're looking for, and I think we all represent a flu shot instead of getting the flu. So it's an opportunity to have that. What, you got your flu shot?
I've never had a flu shot.
You've never had a flu shot. As good as we make it for each other. And I really, really appreciate what you said, Councillor Bart. I think you're absolutely right. If this is one tool in the toolkit to support good governance, we're talking about Councillor Anderson, where there have been some councils that have tried to do a code of conduct at a point where they never could achieve consensus on it because they were really not fit to be there in certain ways. They were legally eligible to be there, but maybe they, yeah.
Okay,
So
if there's no further comments, then maybe we'll...
I will do a review for the strategic planning session. And
Code of conduct development as part of the strategic.
yeah, include the code of conduct development as part of the strategic planning process.
Okay, so is there a second? Second. Motion's carried. Next item is ABICC request. Has anyone got any brilliant submissions that they would like to put forward?
Projects in the world had And Pat,
Well, we'll entertain whatever motion.
sorry, if I might just say, once in a while, the ever watchful public does give us suggestions about that.
And next item is a report on water.
Never put it in writing.
No, you don't need glasses. This is just
The purpose of my presentation tonight is, well, there's two reasons. One is to just talk about the process of long-term borrowing, similar to how I did, remind everyone what the process is like, and then go into the current demands on borrowings and what is going to be coming up at the January 22nd meeting. So this is an opportunity to discuss it in detail, and then we'll have. So some of this will be repetitive and similar to how I discussed it in council orientation, some current demands that we have, the long-term borrowing process overall, a detailed discussion on what our borrowing limit is as a municipality, and then talk about some items coming up as part of the budget meeting. It's fun. There we go. Okay. Thank you. And those limits are laid out in regulation, and the general discussion of that is in the community charter. So we have the municipal liabilities regulation. There are limits to that. And they're established by regulation. The limits must be included in the relevant period of the financial plan before they are incurred. So as we go through our 5-year financial planning process, and we can't adopt a borrowing bylaw or proceed with borrowing unless that liability is laid out in the appropriate year of the financial plan under special circumstances. And so we have talked about this before. Certainly if we would go beyond that borrowing limit, that's something we want to lay out in a policy. In what circumstances would we not do that? So liabilities under agreement. Council may incur liability under agreement for a prior elector approval for most things. There are some exceptions to that. We have revenue anticipation borrowing, and that is mostly used for cash flow purposes. Taxes are due and paid in July of every year, but we do need to spend. Short-term capital borrowing is also an option to us. That means a very specific thing. There are limits of bylaw for that, and adopt with the approval of the inspector before we would contract a debt for it. And it must be payable no later than the lesser of 5 years or the life expectancy of the asset. So this short-term borrowing by amount of debt and the purpose for which the debt is incurred. Long-term borrowing, which we've been talking about a lot lately, particularly with bylaw, with the approval of the inspector to incur that liability. So as you're all aware, we have a loan authorization bylaw for the wastewater treatment plant at third. We are going to incur debt, have that loan authorization bylaw at third reading. So that's prior to the following information: the wastewater treatment plant facility, as well as any associated infrastructure. The maximum amount to be borrowed, and because the loan recommended that amount be quite conservative, so on the higher side. You don't have to borrow the full amount that's in that authorization bylaw, but you don't. And then it also includes the maximum duration of the bylaw. The bylaw for the wastewater treatment plant includes a term of 30 years. And that's 30 years or the life of the asset. And so the loan authorization bylaw is valid from 5 years from the date of adoption. So as I mentioned, the term of the debt cannot exceed 30 years. We went with 30 years for the wastewater treatment plant, the amount that's in that to lessen the burden on an annual basis on the taxpayer. Elector approval, as I mentioned, is required for some loan authorization. Requirement on the Environmental Management Act. It is a project that was included in our approved liquid waste management plan. As you're aware, we're in the process of amending that to go out and seek approval of the electors. Talk about it a lot to date, but it is going to play a role in some decision making likely at the January 22nd meeting. council can borrow funds without having to get approval of the electors, even though it's a type of more. The municipal liabilities regulation, which lays out our limits to borrowing, limits the annual cost of revenue calculated under the regulation. So the regulation tells us which property taxes, unconditional grants that we'll receive on an annual basis, and revenues that are under the municipality's control and considered consistent income. Analyzes that data, and they come up with that revenue figure for us. And when we go out to borrow, we use that revenue calculation number. We take 25% on an annual basis. And debt servicing refers to the interest and the principal repayments. So there are some exemption debt. The annual debt servicing costs of the total liabilities do not, if they don't exceed 5% of that annual calculation of revenue. Some numbers to that now, so it makes a little bit more sense. So the top part of the screen is our liability servicing limit certificate, and this is information and the numbers that the ministry has approved as of the time you want to submit the certificate and establish your borrowing team data. It takes until about halfway through the year before you have the previous year. So this summer we'll have the 2018 data of 547. And that's the revenue calculated as per the municipal liabilities regulation. We are paid to back that up. So the approval-free liability zone is 322,223. So that debt servicing on an annual basis before we have to go out and seek approval of the electors. So the current annual debt servicing is already at 200. Liability zone is to borrow more debt that would not exceed an annual repayment of $113,921. Back to that $113,921 a little bit later. Regarding the proposal and authorizations, the following three items are met. Notice is published in accordance with the requirements in the charter, and that electors are provided with an opportunity to that electors can respond and how they would do that. And the number of elector responses received is less than 10% example, and 100 people replied not or against the borrowing proceed. If 200 or more were to respond, then that it wouldn't pass. And we saw this in the in council orientation, but I just wanted to remind council what the process of borrowing looked like. Just a little bit bigger on the screen. It's okay if we can just see the top half.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Okay, great. So we start with the loan authorization bylaw and get it to 3 readings. And once we're sure with the amount that we're borrowing, we will proceed with getting inspector approval. And then wastewater treatment plant, we won't have to, but in some scenarios we may have to. Then the bylaw is adopted, and there's a 1-month quashing period. And disagree with the decision, and then we proceed from there. Corporate officer certificate would be signed off on if of approval from the inspector. We likely won't need it all at once. We are applying for a large grant for a project like that, so we're going to run into some cash flow problems. So what we already, when we need cash, they will forward it to us. We've received grant funds, we will pay it back. When we need cash from the borrowing or fisherman, until the project enter that process once the borrowing bylaw has been approved and signed off on. We work with the regional district and the borrowing goes through the regional district, but they need to establish a bylaw when we're ready to lock in that long-term borrowing. Okay, you can go back to the presentation. Thanks. So our annual servicing limit shows us how much we have to borrow in total. So this is not so our borrowing limit, we begin with the municipal revenue figure of $6,944,547. That number is provided by the ministry. To borrow an amount that would allow us to repay $1,736,137 in interest and principal every year in costs. And so that's deducted based on 2017 debt servicing of $186,503. That gives us, if we borrow after that amount, it's our responsibility to calculate that and deduct it from what we have available. And so that gives us an annual. So from that we work backwards and we come up with what our current debt servicing conservative interest rate, and I've come up with a figure of $27,260,000. That's basically based on that debt servicing limit. That's a lot of discussions happening, a lot of demands on borrowing. I wanted an opportunity to get in front of council, and it may not look familiar to you. The wastewater treatment plant servicing is familiar to council. We do have a bylaw at third reading at 16,002. Of the other two projects, which I want to focus mostly on tonight, and then bring the approval-free liability zone discussion back. It's budget yet, but this is likely going to grant. We're applying for a grant of 73%, and so we're looking at approximately a figure of $1,866,900. The second meeting, detailing out the budget, talking more about what the components of that project will look like, what it can look like, what council would like to do. For discussion purposes, I do go conservative and I do go on the high end. That's all I'll say about this. And this, I don't know how familiar council is with this or how much it has been discussed. The Tofino Housing Corporation will be formally requesting that the district guarantee a loan for pre-development costs for an affordable housing development. It's from BC Housing. It's the ability to go out and examine a project and see the viability of the project, and then it's essentially repaid through that. These funds typically have so they can be called and repaid or requested to be repaid at any time. Typically they are not, if the project continues, it'll roll into the mortgage. So we've been trying to work with BC Housing as well as the Tofino Housing Corporation. It is a workable request for the municipality. Having a one-year term with a demand loan for a one-year term, it just 780 in 1 year puts us above that approval-free liability zone, and it also requires us to go out. So we've worked with BC Housing to make the term of the loan 5. We would like to use that approval-free zone or not. I'll just go back to the indoor rec facility for one moment. Free liability zone. The annual repayments are below that threshold and the room we have available to us. But the two, whatever occurs first, which in this case would likely be the PDF loan with the Tofino Housing Zone. So let's say, for example, council approves the guaranteeing of the PDF loan and decides that they would like to use, there's no ability to use that for the indoor recreation facility because there won't be room left in the approval-free zone. So it will be facility by way of a referendum or alternate approval process. Discussed this evening, we've talked about the approval-free liability zone just in just what it is and how it works, but to get in front of council and have council have to make that decision too quickly. So this is an opportunity to do the two projects if we need to in advance of that meeting. So I'll just complete the presentation here because I have the next slide shows you it's an ongoing discussion, and I don't know if we are going to be borrowing for it. I know that has been on the table, it's been off the table. If we proceed with all these commitments that are up on the screen here of $9,524,250. Are there any questions?
Yes. First, Councillor Thomas.
From what I understand from this, we don't
Yes.
have a loss in one of the
Yep.
numbers. Thank you.
The borrowing. My understanding is that the municipality takes the loan out through necessity because the library is paying for that loan.
It may not, but from my understanding, based on the borrow for those components, then we would certainly have to show it here.
Other questions?
And so I'm clear on the situation with the borrowing approval freely. The main issue would be at this point, if we were to proceed with both at the same time, the indoor rec facility would probably, that's correct?
Likely, based on the timelines that are, I think that the Housing Corporation is going to proceed be constructed in 2020, and so the borrowing is expected to occur in that year as well.
So if it could be conceived of as a limitation, the limitation, if perceived that way, would be for an alternative process.
Yes.
You want to leave some borrowing capacity, maybe for emergencies or things that break down suddenly. Is there any so much leeway you might want to leave?
I think the best practice would come in with reserve levels. And so as we develop our reserve policy, our reserve fund policy, which I'm working on, reserve fund balances in the case where there is an emergency. Reserve fund balances could be used for infrastructure. I do hope that never happens. If it allows in our policy that we would go over that borrowing limit, say for a major water main project or something like that, we could get approval to go above our borrowing limit if we've exceeded it or if we've maxed it out. And then we could use reserve fund balances to repay. So I would say more the best practices, we should focus on what our reserve levels would be for a municipality of our size with our infrastructure.
Okay, great. Everyone's got that. Okay.
Okay. So the next slide, it looks very similar, but I've included the tax increase and tax impact that would be required to through taxation. There is the opportunity with the wastewater treatment plant that we could do financing through utility fees, and we haven't. On the first one, it's a bit alarming, a 29% tax increase. That's a 29% increase on the taxation revenue that we're currently 9%, because there's a lot of factors that play into that. But the overall budget would have to increase 29%. The overall taxation budget would have to increase term. And as for the indoor recreation facility, a percent of taxation is approximately 30,000, just so you're able to put numbers to that when we think about it. And so we've done those because the life of the asset will be beyond 30 years. We've shown it for 25 years for discussion purposes. Funny one, because we are guaranteeing the loan, we're not actually making the payments, the repayments on the debt. And there's actually no payment. The funds are forwarded, it's 0% interest, and there is no obligation to save for it. So he falls off. We've been taxing for it for 3 years. It's going to go into a reserve fund for repayment of financing. So we could use it for the wastewater treatment plant, we could use it for repayment on indoor rec facilities. But it would. Okay, any questions on tax impact? This discussion is all going to come to the budget meeting as well, so this is.
Just, yeah, maybe a quick one. Do those numbers change if, or with the...
Well, so
the
this is
percentage.
an increase on what we're currently taxing. So if all other of our services, we'll need to increase that taxation amount by 29%, regardless of what assessment values. So that's why you don't see a 29% increase on your tax bill, because it is also based on what assessment values do.
In what areas is it?
Okay. So just so we're able to make better decisions when debt discussions do, as mentioned before, is really going to inform this discussion, because if we want to increase service levels, we'll likely need to put in more infrastructure. They happen together, and we move, to the upper limit or exceed our limit without having a policy. We certainly need to contemplate when we would exceed that limit, have an opportunity to discuss that. So at the January 20 community sustainability, and I may insert a few comments in the report as well, and that'll be an opportunity to discuss the budget application that is due the following day. A request coming from Ian Scott, the executive director. He will come as a delegation and do a formal request for the council have any questions about this presentation in that moment, or would like to discuss it prior to that meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before she starts, I'm going to just turn this here.
Hello. So we're moving on to the multi-use path condition assessment, public spaces, cultural and visitor initiatives.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council. As part of the 2018 compliance with current standards and to formalize a set of recommendations regarding improvement and maintenance of the path. Dancing unicorns. There we go. So the report looked at a number of things. The assessment was actually done on August 29th, so it was a really great time for people, as it would be on any August day. And they did comment on just how blown away they were by how much use the path was getting. Main challenges we have on the path right now. And the report GIS mapped where all of those issues are, and so we're able to look at that GIS map and identify where they looked at signage consistency. The path has been constructed over 25 plus years, bit by bit by bit by bit constructed. I think the standard was something like 1.2 or 1.5, and now it's 3 meters. So we have all these different sections. There's not a lot of consistency. So that's one thing they looked at and made recommendations for what recommendations around those. Another thing they looked at was crossings. So driveway crossings and road crossings. It's sort of all over the map. Recommendations around markings and signage at locations like that, including what you often see in the big city is the conflict areas. Another thing that was looked at was geometry. So that's the width, the distance from the highway, which is called the clear zone, and then the grade. There's some images there, you know which way you're looking, about the opera image you see there, which is the Abraham Drive area. The south side of Abraham Drive, I should say, because the other side has been widened for operating space that's available. And then here's some pedestrian operating spaces as well. And the two and that space is eaten up quite quickly. So here is what this is a PDF of the GIS that actually fit nicely horizontally on the screen there. But you can see each one of those numbers, the 46, 47, 48, all of those are where there's an signage non-conformance there. You can see the stop signs. That just indicates that there's a signage issue there as well. And then in the report itself, if you looked through that's there, and then recommendations about how to make improvements. So the priority segments by condition, they're broken into kind of logical sections by landmarks or by where the path is, to a certain standard, the whole. And then the cost estimate, that's based on recent construction in the area. As we know, we upgraded a section this year, so we have some pretty recent construction, just over $500 a meter, so it's quite a bit. I say this is condition priorities by, just like with the road condition report, choose to, for example, the Abraham Drive to just north of Helison, replacement versus Sharp to Jamie's, which is maybe a little quieter as some of the higher density areas. In terms of infrastructure investment, the district to date, it's about every 3 years. We make a major capital investment in the multi-use, but we had to, so currently,
I turned my phone off, but there's one call.
Investing again until 2021. So we may want to revisit that. Because as you can see, these are only the first. Natural resources are not limitless, and that coordinated inspection and maintenance activities will help extend the life of our MUP infrastructure, as well as help manage risks, surface for longer, and of course also help manage the risk of someone slipping and falling, etc. from loose gravel. Any questions about the?
I have a question, thanks. Did the consultant speak at all about whether there was any way, because as a cyclist myself on the MUP in the summer, that repetitive for commuting and just knowing where certain took a hammer and hammered out a section of asphalt and route in a way to create a channel for bike tires to go through. That was so helpful.
These segments, and this is a summary of just the top 5, but there's much more detail in the report. I mean, they're just meters as well. And when we look at the whole report, has a lot of detail, sections like this, you might choose to go, well, 49, 50, and 51 on what would that cost. I think what we run into, though, is that by the time you've mobilized a contractor, it's a long way resources for such a small section, so you want to look at making it worth our while, and maybe we target the top 10 sections that are really problematic and do them.
Is there a way to get feedback from the public on this? Because we have some really regular commuters.
Yeah, I'm sure we can look at a way to do that.
Thank you.
Councillor Chalmers?
I'm wondering if there's been much discussion made with reflectors. I know there is a responsibility for people to be prepared to bring lights, but sometimes
Yeah, it wasn't within the scope of the report. It was really looking at the condition of the multi-use path. And it's unlit right now, but certainly that's something, that type of thing.
It's a solution for now or a band-aid, and I think we need to start thinking of the future a little bit. Like, if the pathway through the park ever gets completed, I think we're going to see more people on the MUP. The population's growing. We're trying to promote planning as to what we're going to do with the MUP. And at the moment, the way this is presented, it's almost looking at Highway 4. It's a never-ending project. So maybe I'd like to see some long-term planning as to what we expect to do with the MUP in the future.
Well, that pretty much echoes partly as a mechanism. The other note that I had made was in terms of the resources that are available, historically we had various funds provide some help in that resource area if there could be maybe some communication with that commission as to, and their eyes as to the costs that are involved. And as we know, it's a huge community priority and used asset that
Fundraising is appreciated. It's some big dollars to come up with, certainly. The 3-year cycle that we've sort of been on with infrastructure, which has been one of the big funders for the work that's been done today. Resort Municipality Initiative fund, using some of those. This path is used by visitors in a pretty big way, and if we're trying to get people to leave their cars at home and walk or bike into town, then...
Councillor Ferry, did you have anything?
No, but if you'd like me to say something.
No, I'm wondering as we go through or look at the plan again, and I'd sort of like to know, come back to a council project by project, if we'll come back to prioritize sections.
Strategic priorities. Planning that this is a real priority for the financial planning process.
I had just one concern that I sort of had was plan, and I kind of agree with the marking of driveways and kind of the value of other signage might be, and the clutter involved with it, because I find that the brim of your bike hat. So I would like to see some sense from council about with how many liabilities might we incur.
It's that recommendation, so we certainly can't implement them all at once in one fell swoop and have signage everywhere, so I think we'll really have to look.
And can I be reminded, or we be reminded, when the multimodal transportation plan is going to be done? And that
Mr. Rogers?
Is it this spring?
It'll be March. It's
Okay.
complete, and
okay.
it does talk about the multi-use path and its importance. I'm not sure if it's going to give us any priority stuff. It might be more of a support for.
And one last question. The cycling master plan that we have,
2008
it's still
cycling master
active,
plan.
right? I mean, it's
not. Yeah, the MUP is included within it.
got it. Okay.
Just a question. It's a MUP. It is.
It is, and it is, we do collect through the capital infrastructure levy for it. Unfortunately, as you know, so we'll get closer to what the replacement value is. So we can use some of the capital infrastructure levy for
A better idea of what it will cost to replace these sections of MUP. We really didn't know before. We're only replacing, not replacing.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Great report. And but I'm worse, but maybe dedicated to other things. We'll find out more, I guess, in the budget process. But 5-year plan that has passed its life. Are we going to be talking about that again soon?
Yes, very soon. To develop a new resort development strategy. So we'll be working on that in the next few months. So yeah, we'll talk about that and identifying new projects.
Excellent.
That's
Bohemian Rhapsody tonight.
I know.
So for the newly elected commission at a committee of the whole meeting, recommending that or requesting direction from council to develop an inspections and maintenance policy for protecting the district from liability. That is the resolution there from the spring. So the district operates and maintains various parks and trails within the community, and in Canada, the Occupiers Liability Act establishes a duty of care. So is it important to understand and ensure that the risks associated with park and trail use are properly managed and exposure to accidentally safe? It is impossible to eliminate every risk, and the courts understand this. But we can agree as a municipality that we want to do something by having a written policy. Sounds very glamorous. So a policy with a maintenance component and care existed and was adhered to. There are many benefits, obviously providing for public safety. I won't go into too much detail there. So I want to talk quickly about the difference between a policy and a procedure. Recognize that local governments are elected and responsible for collecting and allocating resources with it, and the local government will be unlikely to be held liable if an accident occurs or someone is injured or sustains property damage. To carry out the high-level direction that council provides. So today we're talking about the change as needed. If we want to change the policy, we have to come back to council. One is complaints-based, which means you do no routine inspections and you only inspect if a complaint from the public triggers. You have scheduled inspections, they're done at regular intervals, and of course you can still inspect the complaints from the public. Determined by an organization's resources. So if you have the budget to inspect every day, well great, but chances are you don't. Fully documented. And I can't underscore the importance of keeping good records of your inspections and the maintenance performed enough. Checklist, I realize this is very small here, but I just wanted to sort of highlight that the type of checklist that would be used there, and then the other one is a playground inspection report. So because we can't be everywhere inspected frequently, and playgrounds are generally considered high risk, and that's why they are inspected. On the checklist, there's generally a rating system where the inspector decides what action to take, whether it needs to be immediately repaired or it's a routine repair and will be marked, flagged as a hazard immediately to be able to notify the public, or improperly carried out, or it's carried out but not documented. Well, we did check it, but we didn't write it down. Makes it very hard to prove. And there's lots of general policy statements in there. Uneven ground conditions, steep drop-offs. This is well supported by Section 3.2 of the Occupiers Liability Act, that a person who seems to have willingly assumed all risks and the occupier is held to a lower standard of care if the entry is for the purposes of recreational activity. We'll set out that the district would do annual inspections of all parks and trails, monthly inspections of playgrounds, the assessment, which we already do, snow and ice control, which is thankfully not too much of a problem for us here, but we are saying in the policy that it will be salted. We just don't have the resources currently to be able to do that. So we're making it clear here, we do not do that. Establish a walking path. So if logs wash up in November, we're not going to worry about it until the spring, and then we'll clear it. So of course, public are always encouraged to report observed defects. Any questions on any of those?
And practices are?
Practices or policy?
And just the practice, this sort of...
It's formalizing it.
Okay.
So while inspections on parks and trails are happening, of course, it's not, sort of hasn't been coordinated. Inspections of playgrounds, inspections happen. We've recently had staff certified in the playground safety inspection. It's a certification. The hazard tree assessment, I would say since 2013, we've been doing it annually every spring. Snow and ice control, and then the beach access is...
Comments, questions? Councillor Steer.
Well, I have to thank April ahead of time for carefully explaining the difference. Said council only gets to do the policy end of things. Thank you very much for that clarification before this meeting.
Counseling 101.
Yes. Quite clear why we don't, because of the cost for the ice control and snow control on the path itself?
It's more the December, we wake up and it's frosty. We can't say that we can have someone out there by 7 a.m. ice, using ice control.
And the other question was on 3A of the policy on the inspection annually. I was curious if storm events, would we have inspections on some of the major, we understand the big wilderness trails would be difficult, but after any the very end that says when necessary, basically.
Yeah, and I kind of went back and forth on the storm language, and X happens, you will do this. And a significant storm in Tofino, there wasn't a lot of damage. I think that staff will have to use their discretion in the operational portion there, and yes, we did have out on the trails inspecting, so. I just wanted to add one more thing about signage. Does this need to be stuck? There you go. And the role that signage liability as well. So on make it as clear as possible. That's an example of temporary signage to mark the hazard, which does play a big role in reducing the liability that the district may see. And then on the other one, the yellow sign, that's on the Monk's property as well, where there's a number of cliffs. You can't put up fences everywhere, but you can let the public know that there is a hazard. And so that's an example of permanent signage that helps reduce liability as well. Well, back to the multi-use path. If the district was to find itself in a position where we just could not find the money to make any improvements in surface, please be cautious, etc. It's another example of how signage can be used. So there is a recommendation for council.
The recommendation, it's just that we adopt it, but committee recommends.
It's the recommendation
to council. Yes. Okay. Discussion on that? Further discussion? All in favor?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to, we've talked a lot of in that kind of initiative.
It would form part of it, but specific to this, the Parks and Trail asset. And we're stating, well, then we need to find a way to resource that. Whether that's more staff or contracting that function out, that's where we would have to look at that.
Is the balance intended to be on the inspections for some of these being annually between public, is that the gap that we're bridging between inspections? I just feel like when I read that park and trail users are assumed to expect, and then we'll look once a year at some of these, that seems like there's a large distance between those two. Like you're assumed to expect all of those or...
Trying to make sure I understand. So obviously we can't inspect every tree in the forest, but still things can happen, and the tree being one example, a tree can fall down, or we can make sure that we can't manage for everything, so we're letting you know what some of the risks are in visiting our parks and trails.
Okay.
We are being clear about the steps we're taking to try.
There's no further discussion. Call the question on the resolution. All in favor? Motion's carried.
Okay.
So just for the folks that there are public spaces, cultural and visitor initiatives, on the stressors, vulnerabilities, and opportunities of Tofino's tourism economy.
Like a 2-minute break while this is loading.
I didn't watch it last night because I didn't think I'd be able to watch it tonight, but you have to.
Come on.
I did see Queen live in 1984 Maple Leaf Gardens, just so you know.
Okay. I didn't even know it. I knew it was music. I love the movie. One of the reasons I'm absolutely into more music. They're not into, I mean, we did kind of have this wayward, in their lives, wayward about music. And that was it. And they were rooted in that pathway and their
Well, some of them had actual degrees in music.
Or one was a Anyway, the music is, I'm just blown away because I just know it's kind of, I did, you know, you always hear it, like, I'm not a real music, but when you're watching it, you go, oh, wait, oh my God, that too, oh my.
Chris May, one of the most underrated guitarists.
Loverboy, oh my God.
Thanks, Elise, appreciate that.
I have the power to edit, so if there are sections.
Thank you.
You will rock us.
My name's Andy Clapham.
Okay, we'll reconvene.
Okay, great. So, last but not least, vital conversation about, because I know this has taken a while. At the August 22nd, 2017 regular council meeting, a motion was put forward to address tourism management issues and opportunities as they are experienced in Tofino. Council chose not to vote on the motion at that time, and the subject was, and this resolution was in fact made, that council will have further discussion on the matter so that staff may receive further direction. Tofino has undertaken related to tourism development, and just about all of these include a collection of indicators related to their successful implementation, effects of tourism, and then the Clayoquot Sound Clayoquot Biosphere Trust Vital Signs Report is monitored. We've been monitoring for 8 years, and it's been published every 2 years. This is the 2018 edition. And here's a few of the types of indicators that are monitored in the report. I can do it. So the emergency room visits at Tofino Hospital, which you can see go up and down, obviously higher in the summer for a lot of reasons. That's when people are outside doing things primarily, but also in the middle there with the big cross sign there, for those of you who can't read it, it's West Coast Search and Rescue. There's another statistic there that tourism, retail, trade, and food services employ over 1/3 of the region's workers, and that's the region, and an idea of the type of things they're monitoring. And of course, a lot of these can be tied to, so what is a vital conversation? It is a facilitated conversation to move your community into action, and a spring data as indicators, maybe additional indicators, perhaps some from our vision to action that may be worth monitoring. And connection of resources within the community. So the Biosphere Trust has generously offered, and I understand they have some funding, would be to better understand how to lens of various community stakeholders. So I would invite council to have some discussion around whether this is something they would like us to.
Okay. Who'd like to start? Okay, Councillor McMaster.
I think, the public has been wanting this for a long time, but I was glad to see when we met with Tourism Tofino, it has some concerns that need to be dealt with, so I definitely will support acting on this.
It's taken a while, but it's worth the wait in the sense of this alliance with the Clackley, brilliant way to go. I just appreciate the whole approach of the report. And I just want to thank yourself, I honor it as well, and anybody else. It really does deliver a very thorough kind of take on what, in terms of detail, it'll go to council. Hopefully that'll be the motion, I trust it will. But Jen Robust, you mentioned a lot of the organizational participation, but I really think the context is this is governments and NGOs and so forth, but I really do think we need to members and how that's determined, I'm not quite sure, but I definitely would like to see that. So anyway, once again, thank you. I'm just on some of the initial kind of.
Any comments over here? No.
Move the recommendation.
Okay, recommendation.
I'll second that.
Trust co-convene one or more roundtables to engage in a multi-participant dialogue regarding the stressors.
Second that.
Okay.
It's already first and
Already
seconded.
seconded, so
Yeah.
any discussion
Snooze,
on
lose.
call the question now? Seeing none.
Okay.
All in favor? Motion's here.
Can I just make a quick comment? I got involved in 2 kitchen roundtable discussions about tourism, but it just reminded me, one was my own kitchen table with others. Don't work in the tourism industry. I had no idea this was going to come up, and we got involved in this very detailed 1-hour conversation, and it just made me, and they had some super interesting perceptions and very informed opinions, I think, on kind of ideas and tracks and things to, thank you.
All right, the next item is the bill.
I do not have a PowerPoint for this first one. Winning. So, building permits that were issued last year, as well as the development permits. And so rather than, I can tell you how many we had. And the value of construction was about $14 million. And is there anything else you'd like to know about building permits today? Interested in so?
Is that retail second page of the report?
Total units created, I think, would be the total number of residents.
Councillor Gray?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious about DP number 518. It says facade changes. The development permits that applied to the changes that happened at that location?
I'm sorry, I'm not, I think we issued them a DP for some facade changes for, I guess, the upgrades that were done.
Yeah, so the upgrades aren't captured if something called facade changes.
Yeah, so again, if you're not changing the building itself or the structure building, so you're putting a new window in or a new door, changing the paint would be under that DP.
Okay, so an internal renovation or an upgrade or a change doesn't get captured in
So
this?
an internal renovation would get change the inside of what it was called before now, I can't remember. There'll be a building permit, and especially for the amount of renovations that were done inside that building, we required a pretty detailed building permit, and that was something that was issued of like cleaning up of the existing structure.
So what's internal?
Yeah.
Just want to be clear.
Sure, and building permit as well as business licensing. And so, you know, is the change inside, it's going to be reflected in business license application. Yeah, in this case, it's just, again, it's just for what you see on the outside, and the inside would be building permits and business licensing. So,
There's no need for motions on the agenda.
Okay, so we'll move on then. Official Community Plan Phase 2 report.
what with trees?
Fancy.
With trees and
Plan approved, no. Great.
They laughed when we first introduced Planapalooza.
Oh, for a second I thought those were pot plants.
Trees and fresh air, natural light.
Oh, I thought you meant before people went to sleep. Yeah,
We didn't so.
Okay, so this following presentation is about the OCP Phase 2 Planapalooza. Some surveys, but my PowerPoint doesn't tell us that, so I'm going to use the PowerPoint. So we've sort of gone through visioning and direct 3, where we're looking at some different options, coming up to community, some questions and some surveys, and the next step in step 3 is kind of on the down low. We're obviously announcing it and inviting people into our consultations plan, industrial way, floodplain mapping, multimodal transportation plan. And so what's going to happen over the next 3 now will be sort of more detailed meetings, and then into a draft for council to start considering. We've been looking to make contact with the right in late spring. We will also, after the first reading, have the OCP head over to the finance department for a review to make sure that lines up with our finance, to introduce the draft bylaw to the community. And then from there on, we go into our second, third public hearing and final readings. So we've got a ways to go yet. Planapalooza. So we had about 100 people show up. We had booths for many different the questions that we were asking for the OCP. We had about 61 responses for that. So overall, we were generally happy with the amount of people that came out. We were also able to provide. So in terms of some of the questions that we wanted answered at this meeting at the Planapalooza was the video, and I think it was an overwhelming response that with maybe a few minor tweaks, the principles that are currently in place for the current OCP. I think for me, what it says is that we haven't, at the core, changed how we think of ourselves or how we want our community to evolve. So I'm going to take growth management. Another question was another sort of topic, our area. We have some ideas of what we think what growth might want to be, but we wanted to check in with the community to see what the community thought. So we also, I'm just going to skip over that third bullet and go to this fourth one. So there's a significant support for residential development, retail, commercial, and more things, 4 items you could choose from. That gives us a lot of direction about what type of growth we think we're going to start planning for the next 5 years. That residential development is probably our focus for the next 5 year to sort of balance out where we've been going. There's still there's a fair amount of comments in the comments box that we had about that. I think that the feedback, such as the CAC policy and our development queue policy, which is council direction to prioritize housing, also anecdotal information that the communities, from what, and I say anecdotal because stuff I'm hearing is that what the community is looking for is more residential housing at this time, affordable. So the next steps, again, we're going to do some focused consultation and policy drafting on housing, growth management, designating our land usage with the other various projects that we have on the go that will link into the OCP. So that's kind of a quick update. I have it here, so I'd be happy to take any questions about Planapalooza or Phase 3 or where we're going or any.
Questions?
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, this is a great event. I would have loved it had there been more people attending, but you know, collectively, you know, it'll give good direction. Focus consultation part, I believe, under this desire for, or I mean, no, I wanted to talk about the focus consultation and as you know, there was an application, for example, came into the downtown, and what we, especially around affordability, is where people can, where's this vitality going to come from? And so I really would appreciate if in the focus consultation, and I don't know if I have to make a motion, that kind of looked at and addressed in terms of envisioning what comes forward so that there's some guidance.
So yeah, it's a great point. Our initial thoughts, or I should say our in mind, but center for the community and possibly start identifying places where it might want to expand to the future. The focus consultations and these other land use designations that's kind of what that conversation is about. So where do you want your residential housing, what type, and that. Another item that you may be interested in is a commercial and industrial review for the region, activities here, what it looks like now, what it's projected to be in the future, and so we'll start planning for it. And so that actually comes in as a line item in the budget conversation. So that should also help us. I mean, it's going to happen soon enough that we will be able to get into the OCP, and it did start making a need in 20 years, and that will really inform that conversation that you were talking about.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you look in everybody, or not everybody, certainly planning, don't look at a place and say up over time. And so, you know, for example, you mentioned if this is the commercial core, what does that mean when people...
Well, as you start thinking about what the downtown wants to look like in 20 years and what type of housing is on the fringes of the downtown core.
Or incorporate.
Pre-zone the downtown to allow all this. We've been forego CACs and all the other stuff that we can talk about, but we get the community. OCP right now, for the last 20 years, has been very, very bullish on the downtown being the core, and it's still, you know, and somebody comes in an OCP and says, yeah, the OCP says downtown core is a place to support commercial, then why isn't it happening? And it does get tied up with, you know, once we sort of redesignate this in the current OCP, then maybe that's kind of one of the conversations you may want to have through the review.
Thank you.
Thanks. The reactions and the feedback from people kind of reflect, I think, a lot of what I hoped to see, and that's what I see. And And I by the support for the principals from the before, and that I think this is a really big thing. One thing that struck me about the event, property owner. And what that says to me is that the people who own property here and who are paying taxes are feeling invested enough that they came, the 120 else. And do they think differently? And if they do, how do we weigh that and how do we...
One comment or a question, I guess, since this does deal with arising where residential meets other, whatever, commercial or industrial uses. And I'm just wondering how conflict into go all together.
No, I think it's actually in the plan, but in all planning and in all land use planning, there's always inherent conflict of many different things, you know. All are a result of the thinking that goes around those conflicts, and so that's the way it'll come out. It'll be, we've looked at this and we've looked forward, and then it just comes down to us doing our job as a staff, and then you as council making decisions. I'm a big supporter of mixed use, above residential, above commercial, but the conflict, one of the conflicts there for us in the downtown core is parking and traffic issues, and we're gonna have to deal with that. And those are the kind of conversations that we can have in a general sense in the OCP, but more specifically through our zoning processes with the new zoning bylaw, and we can start sort of drilling down a little bit deeper at that time as well. But we definitely do want to consider the complexity.
Questions? No, we'll move on. Thank you for your update.
That's why they put me in the cleanup.
Okay, and I guess you're going to stay there in case we have any questions on the next one.
There are two recommendations in front of committee of the whole today. One is to receive report for information, and then the second is sort of some active zoning amendment applications that have been in the queue for at least a decade. No, just some of the left.
So let's look to, there's 3 inactive. What would councils or committees wish?
I just have a quick question here. What are the ramifications of just leaving them inactive and not doing anything? Just
you know, for ramifications, probably speed me up on the idea of getting that delegation bylaw changed, and if land use fair, they say that we're not currently working on them. Yeah, corporate services might have an issue. They have these.
There are FOI implications, so if we're able to close a file, then we can at least at some point in the future disposition that file. Otherwise, it just literally will stay.
That actually answered my question.
Oh, it answered your question, okay. Councillor Baird?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with all of the, and a lot of what was, as I recall, happening had to do with the OCP and so forth. Then let's go through the OCP process and seeing if that changes anything substantially in terms of this application and respect to sort of a broader cleanup effort.
Councillor McQuaid?
Do we have any guidance on, is there a sunset clause as to when these become null, void, or taken off?
I'm sure by it doesn't have that.
Would it be beneficial to create that?
Yes.
Would you like?
All kind of jobs that we just haven't really got around to doing, and but it's definitely on the list. It may be an opportunity when we open the land use app, that it may be an opportunity at that point to put that into the bylaw.
Yeah, I prefer not doing multiple
Yeah.
amendments separately if we're gonna.
The Surf Shore Estates one, my recollection is that was, or is it?
No, we've never read a first reading. That was something I dealt with when I first started here. There were a lot of meetings, but there was nothing ever in 2005. So we're talking 15 years. And again, there hasn't been any movement on that in probably 3 years.
That's all. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think so.
Let me tell you the bad news.
Oh, unless you wanted to talk about that.
Did you have something specific on that, or?
No, it's just here. I just didn't know if there was something that was going to be commented.
You guys need a planner? That's great news.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great news.
Yeah.
And when does this person start?
good for an extra week, so we're going to start on the 4th of February. And we hired a new immigration programmer, Matt Lee. Matt starts next week. So.
When, in the same kind of vein as the last conversation about when things have their life cycle, is if there's not any action going forward, like,
It's done.
yeah.
It's finished. We don't move it.
No, but if it does get permission to proceed, there's a few of them, or a couple that had permission to proceed. Okay, thank you.
Really significant volume of rezoning applications that we have. So if you think of, it's almost like, think of the same way you think of absorption, around a half dozen rezoning applications in a year. We'll chase down a more accurate number. If you look at, we have, going to be a matter of quite some time before some of these are actioned on. And so Aaron has moved really quickly on hiring somebody, and we'll see how it goes for a year. But if we want to get these moving, it may be that if you try and get this moving. So this is, while they were more complex in nature, this is so just to give you a bit of an idea that there's a lot here.
It's always more effective when someone else does your mowing.
Well, it's good to know how deep the water is for swimming in the area. Any members of the public have any questions?
Sure, who's the new planner?
Who's the new
Local boy.
local young man?
How many questions do I get?
It just says
Up
question.
to 2 minutes to address
How
matters on
can
the agenda.
a regular person and or group be the OCP, or can they, now that the plan of blues is over?
You can come
Put that to Aaron.
Oh, okay.
open houses and have certain interests, and then so what their interests are, and try to target successions of the OCP that they may be interested in. But again, I'm also available. You can call me, appointment. We can
Is there a public component to commenting on the draft as well?
For sure. So I think what I expect to do is so have the first reading just to sort of get it set, and then at that point we'd stop. We'd go to finance, and then also start doing some. We'd sort of ask for a lot of information without anything firm to talk about, and so to give the community a chance to talk about an action document may be the quickest way. From what that's how I think we're going to run it the same way we run our zoning well.
Okay.
Lots of chances to go back and forth if we have to.
Is there room in the budget for popcorn?
Is there room?
Monday nights?
We accept donations.
Just saying.
Okay, motion, did you have second, all in favor? We are adjourned.
What's happening?
Well,
I'm so sad.
No one's contesting
Have you not seen that?